hat sich natürlich aktiv betätigt und war sicherlich als Cousin.
Determined to be heard before it's too late. For 70 years, Johann Schmidt Jr. carried a name he never asked for, a legacy that stained every room he ever walked into. He was more than just a man. He was Hitler's cousin. And for most of his life, he did everything he could to forget it. But now, before he dies, Johann wants to tell the world what he saw, what he knows, and who Adolf Hitler really was. History has painted Hitler as a monster. But what if his own blood tells a different story? To make sense of what Johann reveals, it's worth asking, who was Hitler before the world knew his name? Who is Hitler? Adolf Hitler wasn't always a monster. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. But monsters aren't born in uniform. They grow quietly. One decision, one belief, one lie at a time. Born in 1889 in Braunau am Inn, Austria, Hitler's early life was not so remarkable. As a boy, Hitler wasn't anything like the man he became. He liked drawing. He dreamed of being an artist. He tried twice to get into art school in Vienna. Both times, he was rejected. And each time, the world got a little darker for him. While he drifted through the streets of Vienna, broke and bitter, he began to look for someone to blame. He didn't look far. He took in all the hate around him by reading anti-Semitic newspapers and listening to overheated conversations in cafes. Over time, being around so much hate changed how he saw things, and the hateful words began to feel true to him. When World War I began, he joined the German army. He wasn't a leader back then, he was a messenger running between trenches. He was awarded with medals, but when Germany lost the war, something within him shattered. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. This is exactly where his rise began. In the years that followed, Germany was struggling. The economy was in ruins. People were desperate for answers. Hitler gave them someone to blame. He joined a small political group, the German Workers' Party, and quickly took control. He had a voice that made people listen. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was angry, and it matched the mood of the room. He then changed the name to the Nazi Party. In 1923, he tried to overthrow the government. It failed. This action alone caused him to go to prison. And while he was there, he wrote Mein Kampf, which means, my struggle. Page after page, he laid out everything he believed. The hate and the fear, including the twisted vision of a pure Germany. Most people ignored it, but they shouldn't have, right? Well, when he got out of prison, he shifted tactics. He decided to gain power through legal means, abandoning any thought of a coup. And he succeeded. When the economy crumbled once more, leaving people devastated, Hitler offered a solution. He promised jobs, stability, and a restored sense of national pride. He was patient, and he skillfully exploited fear. In 1933, he was named Chancellor of Germany. It was supposed to be a political compromise. Instead, it was the beginning of something irreversible. Once he was in control, he disregarded all the rules. He eliminated his rivals, closed down newspapers, and outlawed other political groups. Within a few months, democracy was gone and Hitler's title changed from Chancellor to Führer. Under his rule, Germany changed fast. Factories reopened. Roads were built. People cheered. But underneath it all, the cruelty was growing. Jewish families were forced out of jobs. Books were burned. People vanished overnight. What started as slogans became laws. What started as blame became violence. The world outside Germany observed with uncertainty and hesitation. Then, the invasion of Poland occurred, marking the start of the war in 1939. This event initiated the most horrific period in human history. Even before the war, before the speeches, the flags, the marching, and the trains, Hitler was just someone's relative. He attended family dinners, served plates, and spoke quietly. And Johann remembers all of it. Before Hitler began to terrify the world, he made people uneasy in a room. It wasn't because of what he said, but because of how he watched and what he didn't say. This is exactly where Johann's story starts from, not in politics, but in a house, at a table, with a boy who would later be unrecognizable. Now, there's what the world knows about Hitler. And then there's what his own family saw when no one else was watching. Inside the Hitler household, family dynamics before Adolf Hitler became a historical figure, he belonged to a family, not a warm or large one, but still a family. And if we're going to understand what Johann remembers, we need to step inside that house. Because in those early years, before power and war, something was already broken. Adolf Hitler was born to Alois Hitler, a government customs officer. Alois was short-tempered, obsessed with control, and often violent. At home, he ran things like a drill sergeant. Hitler's mother, Clara, was the opposite. She was soft, devout, and almost painfully gentle. Hitler clung to her because she was the only person he seemed to love without conditions. They had 6 children, but only 2 survived past childhood, Adolf Hitler and his younger sister Paula. Paula was quiet, shy, and never liked attention. Hitler respected her, but not in a brotherly way. It was more like someone guarding a fragile object. He rarely showed affection. Even she said so. They lived under the same roof, but they weren't really close. Dinners were formal. Their father's voice filled the room more than conversation. Hitler didn't speak much, he watched, followed rules, and learned early how to disappear without leaving. And then, slowly, he began to detach. As he grew older, his circle shrank. Inside his own family. He once said, "I am a completely unfamiliar being. That's just how I am." He meant it. He lived it. Even the people who shared his blood became strangers over time. One of them was Angela Hitler, his half-sister. They had the same father, Alois Hitler, but different mothers. Angela was born during Alois's second marriage, before he married Clara, Adolf's mother. She was about 7 years older, and for most of their childhoods, they weren't especially close. But years later, when Hitler rose to power, Angela became active in his life and ran his household for a long time. She did it first in Munich. Then later at the mountain retreat in Berghof. She cooked, managed the staff, and tried to keep the place running like a normal home. But even she had her limits. The only person he allowed close to him was Jelly, Angela's daughter. However, there was the painful story of Jelly, who died by a gunshot in Hitler's apartment at 23. Rumors spread, with some saying Hitler was obsessed with her, and others claiming she took her own life. Till today, one really knows what happened, but she vanished from every photo and story. Some claimed he had locked her inside the apartment during their final fight. However, Hitler wasn't there when she died, but that didn't stop the doubt and rumors from swirling. After Jelly died, Hitler grew more distant. Cold became his default. He cut people off in quiet, permanent ways. He forced Paula to change her last name to Wolf, the same name he often used as an alias. He didn't want her to be seen as his sister in public or even during conversation. He supported her financially, but from afar. Always far away. What about Johann Schmidt Jr.? He wasn't so close, but he saw the effects of Hitler's behavior echoing through the family, like how people avoided mentioning Jelly, how Paula's name changed, and how relatives feared being seen near him. These weren't secrets a child could ignore. At family gatherings, Hitler showed up not because he wanted to but because he had to. He left as soon as he could. When he became powerful, the cutoff became official. Jelly's memory disappeared from public view. Paula was pushed into silence. Angela, once trusted, was quietly moved out of his inner circle. Cousins like Johann weren't even mentioned, they were folded out of the frame, like old photos you no longer wanted to see at all. By the time the world called him Führer, he had no real family left, not by connection or feeling. They were either dead, distanced, or forgotten. Yet, Johann remembered. Not just the political speeches or rallies, but how a room fell quiet when this man walked in, how people avoided eye contact, and how a young boy's presence could feel like pressure. This is the version of Hitler the world never got to see, and it was also the version Johann could never forget. Every infamous figure has someone who saw them before the world did. For Hitler, that person was Johann Schmidt Jr., and his story is the one we never heard, until now. Who was Johann Schmidt Jr.? Long before he became the cousin of the most feared man in modern history, Johann Schmidt Jr. was just a boy growing up in the quiet countryside of Austria. At that time, his family name was insignificant, it held no influence, didn't affect his interactions, and didn't cause him any worry. That would change later. The last time Johann saw Adolf Hitler was in 1907. It was a family visit when Hitler was a teenager. He was already distinct, though not yet dangerous. He didn't engage in play or laughter, but observed. Well, this was the last time their paths crossed in person. When the war ended in 1945, the world wanted someone to answer for what had happened. After the Allies won, Europe was destroyed, and the world started punishing the guilty. But if you were a Hitler, you were seen as guilty right away. This was how Soviet agents took Johann, who was 18 when they came for him. He was arrested along with 4 other relatives. His father, Johann Sr. His mother, Maria. Including his 2 cousins Eduard and Ignaz. They were accused of having too much knowledge and supporting Hitler's plans against the Soviet Union, though nothing was proven, but it didn't matter. They were taken from their homes and sent to a Soviet labor camp in the east. It was a harsh sentence, given without legal process, fueled by anger. Their crime was their bloodline and name. Life in the camps was actually a lot, with prisoners working from morning until night. Food was scarce, diseases spread, and guards were cruel. Survival was a daily struggle. Some relatives didn't survive. Johann's parents died in 1949 and 1953. His older cousin Eduard also died without ever leaving the camp. Maria and Ignaz died in custody. Johann literally lost everything, including his home and family. Finally, in 1955, something surprising happened. The Soviet government released him. Johann left the camp alone, wounded, but alive. He returned back to his home Austria, which he barely recognized. His town had grown quiet. His house was gone. He had no siblings, no parents, only a name that carried dark history. People recognized him but avoided him. Some stared. Johann kept living. He found some doing and built a life for himself. But everywhere, whispers followed. He hadn't chosen the name, but he carried its weight. For years, he was quiet. He didn't complain. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for sympathy. He only wanted to live in peace. He had chances to speak and also had reasons not to. However, what stopped Johann from telling his story? And what changed, all these years later? Why Johann kept silent? Johann Schmidt Jr. was silent because he was scared. It wasn't a fear that went away easily. This fear was taught, reinforced, and deeply earned. The thing is, in Nazi Germany, punishment extended beyond the accused. It is a practice called Sippenhaftung, or family arrest. If someone was suspected of a crime, their whole family could be punished, regardless of how distant the relationship. Blood could betray you, so people learned to stay silent, and Johann learned this early on. When the war ended, and Hitler was dead, Johann wasn't free. He was hunted. While he was in prison, interrogations came at random times, sometimes at night, often without warning. You were asked confusing questions and accused of things you couldn't explain. The goal wasn't answers, but control. When answers weren't given, they were fabricated. There were forced confessions and signed documents. Because of these, silence became a survival tactic. Every word was dangerous, so Johann stopped talking. His father, cousin, and mother died in the camp, not from bullets, but slowly, from hunger, frost, diseases, and backbreaking labor. There's no record that they were executed. Their deaths were the result of systematic neglect and physical breakdown, which was tragically common in the Soviet Gulag system, especially for prisoners held on political charges or held without trial, just like Johann and his family were. And no matter how ordinary his life became after he was out of prison, there was always the unspoken question hanging in the room: what did he know? This particular question haunted every Hitler relative. Some said they didn't know anything. Others hinted they knew more than they wanted to admit. A few distanced themselves entirely. So, did the family know about the Holocaust? You've probably heard the word before, Holocaust. But what does it really mean? It wasn't a single day or a single act. It was a slow, systematic attempt to erase an entire people from the earth. Between 1941 and 1945, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime carried out a campaign that led to the deaths of 6 million Jews. This campaign was what they tagged as the final solution. And it didn't stop with the Jewish people. Millions of others were targeted too: Roma, the disabled, LGBTQ+ individuals, political dissidents, anyone the Nazis decided didn't belong in their perfect world. It began with laws, boycotts, and ghettos, leading to trains and camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, which were death factories. A place where people suffered, were deprived of food, stripped of dignity, and many never made it out alive. And here's what makes it harder to process: some of Hitler's own family members claimed they didn't know. We can't speak for all of them. But the truth is, some likely heard whispers of deportations, trains, and disappearances, making their beliefs and acceptance difficult to measure. In Johann's case, he said nothing. Not because he was guilty, but because silence had kept him alive. Speaking out meant reopening wounds that had barely healed. It meant putting himself, and possibly others, at risk again. His trauma wasn't only from what he endured. It was from what he saw happen to the people around him. He carried the weight of their suffering, their deaths, and the guilt of survival. His secret wasn't about Hitler, it was about fear and its impact on those caught in someone else's war, a question history's still trying to figure out till date. You've heard about the crimes. But what about the other cousins? The ones who stayed home, kept quiet, and still paid for it. Let's look at what happened when guilt was inherited. The fate of the others. When the war ended, it didn't matter whether you'd fought for Hitler or not. In some places, being related to him was enough. This was what happened to Maria Schmidt. She was Johann's cousin, married, quiet, not involved in politics. But her last name was Schmidt. And that was close enough. In May 1945, she was taken away from her home by Soviet agents, along with her husband, Ignaz Koppensteiner, and her brothers, Johann Sr. and Eduard, all without a word of explanation or any legal process. They were all sent to Moscow. Maria spent her first weeks inside Lefortovo prison, a cold stone building where light barely reached the floor. She was interrogated over and over. The same questions, again and again, until her mind couldn't tell the difference between memory and exhaustion. Eventually, she confessed, saying, as a cousin of Adolf Hitler, she had had a connection with him. That sentence, word for word, was pulled straight from her Soviet interrogation file. It wasn't true. But it was what they wanted to hear. She was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. They sent her east, into the Urals, to a prison camp near Verkhneyarsk. The cold there was a lot, and she later died in 1953. Her brother Eduard lasted a little longer. He was already sick with tuberculosis when they took him in. But the interrogators didn't care. They didn't want truth, they wanted names. They wanted confessions. And eventually, they got one. Eduard admitted he was related to Adolf Hitler and confessed to having approved his military political plans directed against the Soviet Union. It wasn't enough to save him. He later died in 1951 at Verkhneyarsk Hospital, with his final letter, pleading for proper clothing, surviving as evidence of his suffering. And then we had Ignaz. He wasn't blood per se, but he got married into the family. He was the husband to Maria, and that alone made him a target. Ignaz eventually died of tuberculosis in 1949 at Lefortovo prison in Moscow. Before he passed, he regretted marrying Hitler's cousin, asking, "Why did I have to marry her?" He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a man who already knew the answer. None of them were soldiers. None of them signed orders. They didn't build camps. They were farmers and clerks, leading simple lives, yet they were punished because someone else had dragged their name through hell. They weren't executed. Not officially. But they were left to the elements. These people passed away in different months, in different years, but in the same place, in a system that didn't care who they really were. Now, after 7 decades of silence, Hitler's cousin is finally ready to open up. And when the last relative of Hitler speaks, the weight of what is held back says more than any headline ever could. What Johann remembered. He always called him the uncle. Not Führer or a monster. Just the uncle. Johann's father and Adolf Hitler were cousins. Their mothers were sisters. That made Johann Jr. part of the family, whether he liked it or not. There was a story Johann's father once told him. One that never left him. Back in 1907, Hitler, still a teenager, came to visit the family. They sat together in the garden. At some point, Adolf Hitler picked up a frog. Without emotion, he started explaining the anatomy. Look, if I hit a nerve here, he'll be dead. Then he cut it open. Calmly. Methodically. Johann's father watched the whole thing. Years later, he still remembered how cold it felt. Not the act itself, but how casual it was. Like someone showing off a party trick. It didn't feel right. Not even then. Johann went ahead to say, my father was terrified. Uncle Adolf then explained the internal organs to everyone. As he grew in power, he didn't pull the family closer, he pushed them away. Like we mentioned earlier, only 2 relatives stayed with him. Angela, his half-sister, managed his home, and her daughter, Jelly, was always by his side, but after Jelly's death, her name was never spoken again, not even among family. Johann once said, he denied his Waldviertel roots and at some point, we were too inferior for him. This was how Hitler saw them in the end, not as family, but as something to hide. When Johann spoke, it wasn't to clear his name. It was to close a door. And on the other side of that door, what was left of the Hitler family had already begun to disappear. Not in the dramatic sense at all, it was very subtle. You had to look closely to even see it happen. Paula Hitler, Adolf's only full sibling, lived out the rest of her days in near silence. After the war she lived under the name Paula Wolf in Birch. Tesgaden. She took an arts and crafts job, kept her head down, and avoided the public eye. She told American investigators in 1945 that she didn't believe what her brother had done. She said she couldn't imagine it. And maybe she meant that. Maybe she didn't. No one really asked her again. She died in 1960. With no children at all. Across the ocean, the American branch of the family had already made their move. William Patrick Hitler, Adolf's half-nephew, had left Germany years earlier. He joined the US Navy, fought in the war, and when it was over, he dropped the name that followed him like a shadow. He changed his name to William Stewart Houston and built a quiet life on Long Island. He opened a medical lab and kept his past to himself. He had 4 sons, Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian. They knew exactly where they came from. And they didn't want part of it. None of them had children. At some point, there were rumors about a pact between the brothers. It is more like a decision to let the bloodline end with them. Alexander later said there was no official agreement. But he admitted his brothers had made their choice and stuck to it. In Austria, the remaining relatives stayed quiet too. Adolf's half-sister Angela, and her children Leo and Elfried, faded from the public eye after the war. They never spoke publicly, never appeared in interviews, never answered questions. And when they passed, their stories died with them. There was no law telling them to disappear. No official record saying the family had to end. But somehow, every one of them made the same choice to fade out of sight, change the name, settle in a quiet place, and not pass the name on to anyone else. Could it be guilt? Or was it the shame? Maybe it was something deeper, like a feeling that the name had already done enough damage. But no matter how powerful someone seems, time catches up with everyone. And in the end, it caught up with him too. Continued in next message due to length. Hitler's last days. By the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler's world was collapsing. The empire he built on fear and mistreatment was crumbling daily. Soviet tanks were already in Berlin. And Hitler? He was underground in a concrete bunker, writing farewells, awarding medals to teenage boys, and shaking with illness and rage. On April 20th, his 56th birthday, Hitler briefly emerged from the bunker to meet with members of the Hitler Youth. These were children, some as young as 12, chosen to defend a city that was already lost. One of them later said that Hitler's hand trembled as he awarded the medals, and his eyes were empty. By then, the war was no longer a war, it was a collapse. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were advancing. While the city above him burned, Hitler remained below, trying to command an army that barely existed. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was tense, like a room where everyone knew the truth but no one dared to speak it. The city's defenses were gone. Food was running out. Hitler refused to accept any of it. He ordered counterattacks that didn't exist. He talked about armies that had already been wiped out. Nobody corrected him. Not out loud. One of the generals he ordered around was Felix Steiner, known for leading German SS troops. Hitler told him to launch a final counterattack. Steiner didn't. He couldn't. There were no troops left to command anymore. When Hitler found out, he screamed at his staff in rage. It was the last time they saw him lose control like that. On April 23, two of Hitler's closest men made their moves of betrayal. Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force and once seen as Hitler's successor, sent a telegram to Adolf Hitler himself. He said that since Hitler was cut off, he was ready to take over. Hitler saw it as betrayal. He removed Göring from all positions and ordered that he be executed. Also, Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS and the architect of the concentration camps, went a step further. He tried to secretly negotiate peace with the Allies. When Hitler found out the next day, he was fuming with rage and ordered Himmler's arrest. That same week, Hitler began putting together what he called his final political statement. He blamed Jews, blamed communists, blamed everyone but himself. Then he made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. A few hours later, he married Eva Braun. She had been by his side for over a decade but always remained in the background. Now, as death approached, she stepped forward and became his wife. It wasn't a celebration, it was more like a goodbye. On April 30th, Hitler and Eva went into his private study. They sat together. A few minutes later, a gunshot echoed down the hallway. His valet, Heinz Linge, and his personal aide, Otto Gunch, were the first to find the bodies. Eva had taken cyanide. Hitler ended his life in the bunker. When his staff found him, the scene they saw was exactly what they had feared. Following his instructions, Linge and Gunch carried the bodies outside, placed them in a shallow crater near the garden, and cremated them. This was how the man who terrorized the world chose to leave it. No trial. No apology. No final speech. Only a quiet end in the ashes of a broken war. The next day, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, gave his children a substance that made them sleep and didn't wake up. After that, he and his wife chose to end it all too. Others followed. One by one, Nazi officials started to take their own lives out of loyalty, fear, or something darker no one could explain. On May 2, Berlin surrendered. 1 week later, Nazi Germany was gone. But the horror didn't stop with Hitler's death. The concentration camps were still full. Prisoners were being forced on death marches. Some walked for miles in snow with no shoes, no food. Thousands died even after the surrender. Far from Berlin, people like Johann Schmidt Jr. were still trying to survive. As at then, he wasn't even aware of the atrocities committed for and in the name of Hitler. But he felt the shift, the silence, and the sudden emptiness of a world that once marched to one man's voice. And the truth is, that silence didn't bring peace. It left questions. Because when a man like Hitler dies, the world wants answers. But sometimes, the people who knew him before the rise are the only ones who really understand the fall. Today, the Hitler family doesn't feel real anymore. It's more like a shadow, something people talk about now and then, but no one actually sees. A few are still alive. 2 in Austria. 3 in the US. No children. No legacy. No desire to be found. The bloodline won't end with any dramatic moment. It'll end quietly like most things do. And maybe that's the only ending it could ever have. But then, if you were born with that name, would you have erased yourself too? Let us know in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.